There is a subtle war waged against the soul, one not fought with weapons of steel, but with whispers of deception and fragments of truth twisted ever so slightly. The human mind is not neutral ground. It is the soil upon which either truth or lies take root, shaping the course of life itself. A weary mind, conformed to the patterns of the world, is like a house built upon shifting sands, fragile, restless, and easily shaken. But there is a path to renewal, a secret known not to the wise of this age, but to those whose hearts are turned toward the eternal. The world would have you believe that the mind is best renewed by self-improvement, by clever philosophies, or by the mere exercise of intellect. But if the soul is to be transformed, it must look beyond itself. There is a wisdom higher than the wisdom of men, a light that no darkness can overcome. It is in the presence of this divine wisdom that the weary mind finds its renewal. The secret, then, is not in striving, but in surrender. To be renewed is not merely to exchange old thoughts for new ones, but to allow the very fabric of one's thinking to be reshaped by eternal truth. The mind must be weaned from its love for fleeting pleasures and trained to dwell upon that which is noble, pure, and everlasting. To set one's mind on things above is to find freedom from the weight of the temporal, to be unshackled from the ceaseless anxieties that plague those who are bound to the shifting tides of the world. The path is not easy. The natural man rebels against the renewal of the mind, for he delights in his own understanding. But wisdom calls out to the humble, to those who know that the thoughts of man, unaided by divine light, lead only to folly. The renewing of the mind begins with an act of yielding not to the whims of culture, but to the unshakable truth that has stood firm before time began. To those who seek this renewal, let them meditate upon the word that is living and active. The mind is the battlefield upon which the fate of the soul is often decided. It is here, in the quiet recesses of thought, that unseen wars are waged. Wars between truth and deception, between light and shadow, between the divine call and the world's clamor. Every great fall begins with a whisper, with a seed of doubt planted in the soil of the mind, and every triumph over temptation begins with a single thought held captive to truth. It is a mistake to think that the mind is a passive instrument, merely absorbing whatever it encounters. No, it is a forge, where ideas are shaped and molded, where beliefs are refined or corrupted. The adversary of the soul understands this well. He does not need to overpower a man's body when he can twist his thoughts. A mind filled with fear will act in cowardice. A mind filled with pride will spurn correction. A mind filled with lies will call darkness light, and light darkness. The greatest victories of evil are not won through force, but through persuasion, through the slow and steady erosion of truth. But there is a greater power, a wisdom that does not yield to deception. The mind that is renewed by divine truth stands firm when the storms come. It is not swayed by fleeting emotions or by the changing tides of culture. Instead, it is anchored, rooted in something deeper than itself. The one who allows divine wisdom to shape his thoughts walks in clarity, for he does not navigate by the dim lantern of human reasoning, but by the unchanging light of eternal truth. To reach this renewal, one must first recognize the battle. The enemy does not announce his arrival with fanfare. He comes subtly, in the form of distraction, of seemingly harmless ideas, of misplaced affections. Many minds have been lost, not because they rejected truth outright, but because they allowed lesser things to take its place. The renewal of the mind is not achieved by mere effort, nor by empty rituals, but by surrender, by yielding each thought to the one who alone can bring light to the darkness. And when the mind is thus renewed, the soul follows, and a man who once wavered in uncertainty will stand firm, unshaken, because he no longer thinks as the world thinks, but as one who has glimpsed eternity. The mind, left to its own devices, is like a ship without a rudder, drifting aimlessly in the vast ocean of human opinion, personal inclinations, and cultural tides. It absorbs the patterns of thought surrounding it, often without question, shaping itself in accordance with whatever it beholds most frequently. This is why so many find themselves restless, burdened with anxieties that seem to have no clear origin. The mind, if not consciously renewed, becomes the product of a broken world, fragmented, confused, and enslaved to lesser things. The world whispers that true transformation comes from within, from the strength of self-will, from the mastery of one's own emotions. But history, both personal and collective, tells another story. The mind cannot cleanse itself any more than a polluted stream can purify its own waters. Renewal must come from beyond, an infusion of something greater than the mind itself. The call to renewal, then, is not an invitation to strive harder, but to surrender more fully. The mind must be reoriented, not merely improved. This is where many falter, for surrender is unnatural to the proud heart. We long to be in control, to manage our own transformation. But the renewal of the mind is not a project of self-determination. It is an act of yielding to divine wisdom. This wisdom is not found in the transient philosophies of the age, but in the unchanging truth that has existed before time itself. Only when the mind ceases its grasping at fleeting ideas and instead anchors itself in eternal reality does true transformation begin. To resist conformity to the world is to engage in a battle that requires vigilance. The world does not seek to renew the mind, but to dull it, to fill it with distractions that keep it from perceiving what is truly valuable. The temptation is always to blend in, to think as others think, to accept what is commonly accepted without question. But a mind shaped by the world becomes restless, for it was never meant to be nourished by the shallow well of human wisdom. There is a deeper well, one that never runs dry, one that quenches not just momentary thirst, but satisfies the soul for eternity. Renewal comes not from adapting to the world, but from transcending it, from allowing the eternal to reframe the temporary. And in that renewal, there is not only clarity, but peace, the kind of peace that no storm can shake, for it is anchored in something beyond the reach of this world. The human mind is a battleground, a place where unseen forces contend for dominion. It is not merely a collection of thoughts and memories, but the very seat of perception, the lens through which reality is interpreted. If the mind is left unguarded, it becomes vulnerable to the influences of a world that does not seek its good, but its captivity. Every day voices clamor for attention, voices of culture, ambition, fear, and desire, each seeking to shape the way one thinks and, by extension, the way one lives. The danger is not always in obvious falsehoods, but in subtle distortions, half-truths that sound reasonable but lead away from the eternal. Without renewal, the mind conforms to these patterns, gradually bending toward what is fleeting rather than what is enduring. But transformation is not passive, it is intentional, a conscious turning away from the lesser in pursuit of the greater. True renewal does not begin with self-reliance, for the mind, when left to its own devices, clings to what is familiar, even when it is harmful. Many attempt to reshape their thoughts through sheer effort, believing that discipline alone can produce the change they seek. Yet, history has shown that human willpower is insufficient to lift the mind from its natural state of anxiety, doubt, and selfishness. The secret to transformation lies not in striving, but in surrendering, not in the accumulation of knowledge alone, but in aligning with truth that transcends human understanding. A renewed mind is not merely one that thinks differently, but one that is rooted in something unshakable, something eternal. It is not enough to reject harmful thoughts. The mind must be filled with what is pure, noble, and everlasting. In this, there is not only renewal, but restoration, a return to the clarity that was always meant to define the human soul. This process is not instantaneous. Renewal is a continuous journey, a daily act of turning away from the transient and toward the divine. The world will always offer distractions, alternative narratives that seem appealing but ultimately leave the soul empty. The renewed mind is one that no longer takes its cues from the shifting tides of culture, but from a deeper source. It is a mind that sees beyond the immediate, that discerns between what is passing and what is permanent. And in that renewal there is peace, not the fragile peace of external circumstances, but the unshakable peace of a mind anchored in the eternal. The world has always sought to shape the minds of those who live within it. It offers its wisdom, its pleasures, its philosophies, each wrapped in the illusion of freedom, yet leading to bondage. The human mind, by its very nature, is impressionable, like clay in the hands of whatever forces press against it most persistently. It is shaped, molded, and conformed, often without resistance, because the process is gradual, almost unnoticeable. The danger is not in the obvious deceptions, but in the subtle ones, the lies that resemble truth, the half-light that masquerades as wisdom. Without vigilance, the mind absorbs what surrounds it, embracing values that seem reasonable yet stand in direct contrast to the eternal. What was once questioned becomes accepted, what was once resisted becomes routine, and what was once foreign becomes familiar. This is the slow, steady erosion of truth in the human soul, not by force, but by conformity. Renewal cannot coexist with a mind that conforms to the world. One cannot walk in two directions at once. To be transformed, one must first refuse to be shaped by the fleeting trends and empty promises that surround them. The world tells us that strength is found in self-assertion, that fulfillment is found in pleasure, that wisdom is found in experience alone. But these are shifting sands, ever-changing and ultimately unsatisfying. The mind that follows such paths finds itself restless, always searching but never finding, because it has tethered itself to that which cannot sustain it. The call to renewal is a call to reject these lesser things, not in anger or bitterness, but in recognition that they cannot provide what they claim. The soul was made for something greater, something eternal, and it is only in anchoring the mind to this reality that true transformation can begin. But this is no passive rejection, it is an active pursuit. To turn away from the world's patterns is not merely to resist them, but to replace them with something far greater. The renewed mind does not dwell on what is passing, but on what is permanent, not on what is shallow, but on what is deep. It feeds on truth, meditates on what is pure, seeks wisdom that does not fade with time. This is the difference between a mind tossed about by every wind of culture and a mind rooted in unshakable reality. It is not enough to remove falsehood. One must cling to truth, and in doing so the mind is not merely altered but restored, returning to its rightful place, no longer enslaved by the ever-changing voices of the world, but transformed by the eternal voice that calls it home. The mind is not an empty vessel but a garden, constantly being cultivated by what it dwells upon. Every thought is a seed, and what is planted most often will take root and grow. Some allow the world to sow its ideas freely into their minds, thinking little of the consequences, only to find themselves burdened by anxiety, doubt, and desires that never satisfy. Others, with great care, choose what they allow to take hold, ensuring that only what is true, pure, and eternal is given space to grow. The difference between a restless mind and a renewed mind is not found in circumstances, but in what it meditates upon. A mind filled with passing thoughts of the world will be unstable, ever shifting with the tides of culture, but a mind that feeds upon the eternal will be anchored, unshaken by the storms of life. Meditation is not a passive act, but an intentional turning of the heart toward what endures. It is not enough to occasionally reflect upon wisdom. The mind must be steeped in it, returning again and again to what is good, allowing truth to shape its very structure. The world is loud, ever vying for attention, filling minds with distractions that leave no room for the sacred. Many find themselves consumed by fleeting matters, unaware that what they constantly behold is shaping them. To be renewed, one must withdraw from the noise and dwell upon that which does not fade. The soul that continually drinks from the well of divine truth finds itself strengthened, no longer tossed about by the opinions of the age, but grounded in something deeper. This is not an escape from reality, but an awakening to a greater reality. To meditate on what is eternal is to see the world with clarity, to understand what truly matters, and to walk in wisdom that does not decay with time. The renewed mind is not merely disciplined, it is transformed. It no longer hungers for the empty things that once held its attention, for it has tasted something greater. And in that meditation, in that continual turning toward what is everlasting, the mind finds not only renewal but peace, a peace that is not dependent on circumstances, but on the unchanging nature of truth itself. The renewal of the mind is not a momentary event but a lifelong journey. Many seek transformation as though it were a single act, a switch to be flipped, expecting that once enlightened, they will remain so without further effort. But the reality is far different. Just as the body requires daily nourishment, the mind too must be fed continuously, shaped not by a single revelation, but by the steady, deliberate turning toward truth. A renewed mind is not the product of one decision, but of countless small choices, each one determining whether the soul is moving toward wisdom or drifting back into conformity with the world. The danger lies in complacency. Many begin the journey of renewal with great enthusiasm, eager to leave behind the burdens of an old way of thinking, but when the weight of the world presses in, when distractions multiply, the temptation is to settle, to assume that past renewal is enough to sustain future clarity. But just as a house left unattended will gather dust, so too will the mind, if not continually tended, fall back into old patterns. The world does not cease its attempts to conform the mind to its ways, and without vigilance, without the daily pursuit of what is eternal, the renewal once experienced begins to fade. This is why renewal must be an ongoing discipline. It is a daily choice to reject the fleeting for the lasting, to meditate on truth rather than be carried away by the noise of the age. The mind, when renewed continually, becomes sharper in discernment, quicker to recognize falsehood, and more resistant to the subtle lies that once took root so easily. The person who commits to this lifelong renewal does not find themselves swayed by every shifting trend, nor do they live in constant turmoil, for they are anchored in something greater than themselves. This journey is not one of striving in human effort alone. True renewal comes not by sheer willpower, but by surrender, by allowing the eternal to reshape the mind day by day. It is not a burden, but a liberation, a shedding of lesser things in favor of something infinitely greater. And with each step, the mind becomes more attuned to what is real, more aligned with what is good, and more at peace. For it is no longer bound to the instability of the world, but grounded in the unshakable reality of the divine. The renewal of the mind is not a task for the faint-hearted, nor is it a fleeting pursuit. It is a call to transformation that demands a continual turning away from the transient and toward the eternal. The world will always seek to mold the mind into its likeness, whispering its values, shaping desires, and leading souls into restlessness. But there is another way, a way that does not conform but transcends, a way that leads not to confusion but to clarity, not to exhaustion but to peace. This renewal is not achieved by mere effort, nor is it a product of self-reliance. It begins with surrender, a yielding of the mind to a wisdom far beyond its own. It requires a conscious rejection of the fleeting philosophies of the age, replacing them with what is true, noble, and everlasting. It is not a single moment of enlightenment, but a lifelong journey, a discipline that must be embraced daily. The mind, like a garden, will bear fruit according to what is sown within it. If it feeds on the empty and the passing, it will remain restless and unfulfilled. But if it meditates on the eternal, it will be strengthened, unshaken by the storms of life. To be renewed is to be restored to what was always meant to be, to think with wisdom, to discern with clarity, to walk in truth that does not fade. It is to be free from the burden of a world that is ever shifting, and to be anchored in something greater, something unmovable. And in that renewal, there is not only transformation but peace, a peace that no circumstance can steal, for it is rooted not in the fragile, but in the eternal.